Okay, guys, fasten your seatbelts. I've just finished going through all my past AP tests and putting together your Unit 5 exam using those AP questions. And frankly, I was surprised at how many questions from this unit there were and how tough they were. So let's just get into it. Do the best you can. Now, here you can relax a little. You do not have to memorize all of these dates, and I'll let you know which ones you really need for the test as we move through the podcast. Still, I personally find timelines helpful. The big dates to keep in mind to help you keep this period straight are the arrival of Christianity as an approved and then an official religion in the 4th century. That's the 300s. The reign of Justinian in the 6th century, that's the 500s, the Iconoclasm controversy in the 8th century and its end in the 9th century, Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800, and Otto coming along about 150 years later. This image does not appear on the test. I snatched it from Wikipedia, but you should recognize the basic diagram and know the term. It shows up on several AP exams. This is perhaps the most famous work in the mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Who's the central figure in this image? What kind of a work is it? In other words, what's the medium? Where was this work made? And the answer is the same city where it's still to be found, and the capital city, I would say, of early Christian mosaics or Byzantine mosaics. Here you see the interior of Santa Sabina. We'll get back to this one again a little later. As a typical Basilican church, what are some of its features? Well, you note the long rectangular or longitudinal nave, the timber roof, the clerestory windows letting in light from above, the apse holding the altar, that's the semicircular space, and the aisles, in this case set off by an arcade. Know these features, okay? And do you see a dome, a barrel vault, or a groin vault? Nope. Those are features of the central plan churches, or the later Byzantine churches that combine basilican form with a dome. Probably the most famous central plan church is San Vitale. The most famous combination, really the most famous Byzantine church of all, is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now Istanbul. So again, note, this is an early Christian, not a Byzantine basilica, also not a Carolingian or Ottonian. Okay, here are some random questions. What are examples of early Christian Basilican churches? You studied 3. You're going to have a question you're going to need to identify one of them. What civilization did Charlemagne admire and attempt to emulate? What famous work did Bishop Bernward commission? Just looked at that. Early Christian catacombs were used not only for burials, but for what? What kind of services? The kind of church plan used by Charlemagne's palace chapel at Aachen was, careful, and think about the church it's partly imitating. You're going to see a question about that in just a few minutes. Did the spatial illusionism of Roman art disappear altogether in this period? Did it appear consistently? You may have noticed on the essay questions how many questions there were that asked for classical elements in Byzantine art and ways in which Byzantine art departs from classical imagery. That's true of the early medieval art as well. So to help answer that last question, consider these 2 manuscript illustrations from the chapter on Byzantine art. These images do not appear on the test. I'm just trying to help you think about it. Do you see some use of perspective and clear body shaping in the illumination on the left? Do you really see any of that in the illumination on the right? Looks like illusionism kind of comes and goes. So here's some more random questions. What is encaustic? You've had that question on AP tests before. You're probably going to have it again. It's a favorite. What is iconoclasm? By the way, there was a question on every single test that I have asking that. I put in about 3 of them and then quit. But yes, you need to know iconoclasm, but it's easy. How was Christ typically depicted in the paintings found in early Christian catacombs? You should look at figure 11.3 if you're not sure. The artworks most associated with Charlemagne's Carolingian courts are, and I'll give you a hint, scriptoria are involved. And what are the artworks most associated with Hiberno-Saxon culture? And hint again, it could just possibly be the same answer. The apses of the most expensive, that's the College Board term, I would read that as famous, or likely to be in your textbook, early Christian basilicas were covered with what? Think of Sant Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna. In fact, think of the most characteristic church decoration, really, of this unit. Now, this image is not in your book, but I included it in your slides, and it showed up on one of the AP tests. You should recognize the very characteristic agitated lines of the works in this illuminated manuscript. So what period is it from? Because those agitated lines and the heavy reliance on line is very characteristic of that period. You don't need a name for the guy. Oops. I'm sorry, that was a leftover from an old set of notes from the test review. So this is found in the apse of the Church of the Virgin at the Monastery of St. Catherine. Sorry, I need to move forward here. In Mount Sinai, Egypt. So what type of work, again, what medium is this? Yes, you get that question over and over again. And the answer is mostly the same in this unit, but later on you're going to be looking at church decorations from other periods. So again, remember that the most characteristic medium for decorating churches in this period is the mosaic. So what's the name for that large oval surrounding Christ? Where's the light coming from in this work? Is it a natural source or is it a supernatural source? Notice too the heavy contour lines that set off the figures. A heavy reliance on line as opposed to shading or other illusionistic devices is characteristic of early Christian, Byzantine, and early medieval work. Okay, this image is not on the exam, but there is a question about the characteristic features of Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells. What kind of figures do you see on this and other similar manuscripts? I thought that was a particularly cool illustration. Okay, where is this image found? And we just looked at this. And here's a trickier question. The figural style on this panel is most closely related to what other kind of artwork? Well, what other kind of artwork is most notably produced by these early medieval Western artists? Back to those illuminated manuscripts. This will be a recurring theme on the test. Okay, this is figure 1226 in your book in case you want to look it up. So this is carved ivory. It's a triptych. What would a religious object such as this have been used for? Oh, and I just gave you the answer to this. What is the structure of this piece called? If it folds into 2 parts, it's a diptych. 3 parts, it's a triptych. And finally, what culture produced this work? Let me give you one clue. The ivory is only 9.5 by 5.5 inches tall, and that might give you a clue as to how it was used and maybe how it wasn't used. Okay, there was a question on the AP test for which I could not find a precise image, but it was your basic, manuscript, illuminated manuscript page. And so I found this one, which is in your book, and it's associated with a female religious leader, the abbess of a convent. This is a picture of Abbess Uta dedicating her codex to the Virgin Mary. So what kind of work is this? Again, this is sort of like mosaic being the answer to many of the questions. Illuminated manuscript is going to be the answer to many as well. But what are the characteristics of this kind of work? And what period or culture produced this work? Well, here's another. What kind of work is this? Hint, it is image 1234 in your book, and actually I now know it's going to come up again a little later. I went through the general multiple choice questions first and then went back to the image-based questions. A trickier question is what kind of paint was usually used on this kind of panel? It's tricky because there are actually 2 answers. Generally speaking, icons are painted, I just gave you an answer, didn't I? Either with encaustic or with egg tempera, pigment mixed with egg. Now this one is egg tempera. The College Board is unlikely to make you choose between encaustic and egg tempera. That's a level of detail you probably won't need. So if it's an icon, it's going to be one or the other. We're going to talk more about types of paint in upcoming units, but I'm not going to worry further about it now. Okay, this is the interior of the Catholicon in Greece. By the way, there's a better image in your book. This is the best I could find that was reproducible on the web and usable in my exam, your exam, I should say. But really, in this question, it's being used as a generic Byzantine domed church. So what image does the central dome contain? And what would the most major domed Byzantine churches contain? This is actually not an ideal image, but it's that large Christ figure holding out his hand. There's a name for that. Remember the term for Christ as ruler of all? And here's a rather tricky question. In a Byzantine church, only the priest and the emperor can enter the altar space, and the altar is located behind a frame, a kind of fence, which is called an... It's one of your vocabulary words. The College Board needs you to know that term, or wants you to know that term. This early medieval manuscript portrays what ruler? What are some of the ways the illustration suggests the importance of the emperor? By the way, you can probably tell I'm moving into the image-based questions, although I have a few more multiple choice still to come. Now, this is going to be one of those all-except questions. Just keep in mind that one of the choices describes all of the figures, not just the emperor. So that's going to be the one that isn't depicting something special about the emperor. And finally, what simple device does the artist use to suggest what the College Board calls spatial recession? In other words, three-dimensional space. Now, I don't see any shadows, and the bodies aren't outlined especially clearly, and the background doesn't really provide perspective, but we can still see, hint, hint, that some figures are standing in front of others. How do we see that? The parting of Lot and Abraham, which won't be identified by name on your test, is an early Christian work. What kind of work is it? Have you noticed how many questions have the same answer? Where is it located? And by the way, that's a generic question, not a specific one. In what kind of a place is it located? But if you want to see more, this is figure 1113. Okay, this is another popular AP Art History image. Where was it found? You saw a Khan Academy podcast about this one. What did the object function as? In other words, how was it used? What was its use? What is the name of the multi-step enamel process used in creating this object, in particular used in creating the sort of shining jewel-like appearance of the work of art? By the way, what kind of motif style is used? I find that an awkward phrase, but it's what the College Board says. Basically, what kind of figures are depicted on this? Finally, how is this work typical of its size and place? In other words, how is it typical of migratory art? Okay, the work on the left is an early Byzantine icon, figure 1216 in your book. So what era would that be? The test gives you a hint. It says the work on the left is a rare icon that survived iconoclasm. Well, I just reviewed pesky dates at the beginning of this test review. Again, you need to know when the iconoclasm controversy broke out, since it marks the end of the early Byzantine period. And obviously this icon is going to date from before the iconoclast period. With that, you should be able to get it right. The icon on the left is also painted with encaustic. That's a term you've run across before, since it's a common technique for getting paint to stick to wood. The work on the right, which we saw earlier, is Russian, and again, it's made of tempera, a different paint technique, but also one you've encountered before. Note that the College Board doesn't ask you to remember which of these is tempera and which is encaustic. Again, they just require you to know what the terms mean. So when was this second image made? I think that's a hard question, but it's in there. Russian iconography actually reaches its zenith after the fall of Constantinople, hint, hint, and that was 1453. So what scene from the Bible is the image on the right depicting? And why would this have been a popular theme in Christian art? And still looking at that Russian image on the right, what classical elements do you see? Is shape defined by line or by use of shading and volume? Is there much individual expression? I'm trying to help you with one of those all except questions. The work, by the way, is image 1234. You may want to review these too. I think these are pretty tough questions. Now we get into some architecture. So these are images of old St. Peter's of Rome, the original church before the current major central church of the Catholic Church was built. It was based on what Roman building style? Another question you're seeing over and over again. What Roman emperor sponsored construction of the church? This is your first Roman emperor who's a Christian, hint. In what century did construction begin? Again, you should know the century of that emperor because it's the century in which Christianity becomes an accepted and then an official religion. What's the name given to that courtyard in front of the building, the one you see on the upper right? What's the name of the semicircular space behind the altar? You get that question more than once. Light entered the nave through an upper. What's the term for those upper windows? And finally, the church was constructed on the site where many believe that St. Peter was, fill in the blank. Okay, you've seen the image on the right before. It's the interior of Santa Sabina in Rome. The image on the left is the exterior. So what basic style of church is this? Remember, there are two basic styles in early Christian architecture. What late Roman building does this resemble? Hint, it's in Germany. And what was the function of the Roman building before it was transformed into a church? By the way, I reviewed some of this in my second to last podcast because I saw this question coming. So note the interior features. This does not have elaborate vaults or domes, but it does have a beautifully carved flat timber roof, which is typical of this church style. And that actually shows up on several questions. The interior shows a row of columns separating the nave from the aisles. I gave you the term for that earlier in this test review. What is it? And what's the term for reused Roman temple columns? I think it's an easy term to remember. I went over it in the second to last podcast. So most churches of this style have a semicircular room on the east side, which house the altar. See that question again? It is called the, if you get that one wrong, guys, at this point, I'll be very unhappy. And finally, how do we see this church decorated? Look at the floors and columns. Lots of Roman marble, right? Okay, this slide shows the exterior and the plan of St. Michael's, Hildesheim. And yes, the College Board does give you this information. Sometimes they tell you the work, sometimes you have to come up with that yourself. The church was built to serve what purpose? It wasn't just a regular parish church or a cathedral. And under what dynasty was it constructed? What is the architectural feature that's perpendicular to the nave? And hint, this church has two of them, which is a feature of church architecture of this particular period, the last period that we studied. And the next question is a little tricky. Since the entrance is on the long side, in architectural terms, the church has lateral main entrances. The interior side aisle also functions as what? The word you're looking for is the same word you use for a church entrance in the more typical Basilican church, where entry is on the short side opposite a single apse. Again, you see why I had you learn those terms. What is the support structure of this church? Which distinguishes it from a Roman basilica? Remember those alternate supports? We just went over that. Unlike most early Christian basilicas, this church has double. It's the second time you need this word. Again, it's the hallway that lies perpendicular to the nave. The arch over the entryway to the apse at the end of the nave is based on a Roman architectural feature, and it has the same name it would have had in Rome. Finally, which element of the church did Bishop Bernward himself design? It's the most famous element of the church and the one we looked at in the most detail. And they just keep coming. Here you see the floor plans of the Pantheon on the left and San Vitale on the right. Both buildings share what distinct and famous feature, which you would see, hint, hint, if you looked up? Both plans are characterized by what term? For once Basilican is not the answer is the other. common early Christian church structure. Now, San Vitale differs from the Pantheon in that it includes what architectural feature? And the answer is that funny-shaped oval that looks like a racetrack. Its positioning still puzzles architectural historians. You've been using this term a lot in the last few questions. And by the way, it's also the entryway to the church and uses the same name that the entryway has in Basilican churches. Beginning to understand again why I re-quizzed you on the parts of a church. What major Byzantine church has a plan most similar to San Vitale's? And I'll give you a hint. It is the biggest and most important Byzantine church. Where is San Vitale located? And finally, both buildings are closely associated with what political figure? And I'm looking for a title here, not an individual, since these are centuries apart. Well, speaking of a very famous Byzantine building, here you see a floor plan and an interior of that very famous building. Sorry, the interior is a little blurry. What is the building? When was it constructed? And who was the building's famous patron? This building, by the way, is a hybrid. It combines what two kinds of church plans? And this was a huge innovation in Byzantine churches. The structural innovation that made it possible to create this huge interior space, to bring in light through the windows, to have multiple domes. There's a term for this innovation that you're encountering elsewhere in the test. Remember those curved triangles? By the way, the architects of this building followed what other profession? I was intrigued to see that in the College Board question, but you may very well remember it from the video. And finally, the original interior was decorated with, what are the characteristic decorations of this period? We're getting toward the end. Some more random questions. What two structures, their churches, are most famously associated with the Emperor Justinian? Hint, one is in Constantinople, and we just looked at it. The other is in Ravenna, and we looked at it as well. At least we looked at its floor plan. Most migratory art of the 6th to 8th centuries consists of, hint, it's got to be easily carried and it's got to meet the needs of a warrior culture. I don't think you'll have trouble figuring out the answer to that one. What is the most characteristic feature of a Byzantine central plan building? Don't overthink this one. It's obvious. Again, you see it when you look up. Animals were used to symbolize what biblical figures? Do you remember the attributes? A few more random questions. What term refers to the general building type typically used in early Christian churches? I think that question shows up in some form or another on every exam. Oops, I think some of these are repeated. I apologize. This looks like the same one we just looked at. Okay, that's good news. This is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. Again, the College Board provides the identification. So what was its original function? When was it created? How does it use prefiguring? And what does that term mean? Now, each story fills its own separate, there's a word for those square areas set apart by pillars or columns. It's in your book. What earlier sculpture style influenced this work? Who is the central enthroned figure of Christ intended to resemble? What biblical narratives are illustrated in this work? And yes, it's okay to look at the picture. Who was the patron of the work? In other words, who was Junius Bassus? And finally, this is a good review question. The narrative is told by arranging the figural groups in, what's the most common organization we've seen in relief sculpture for narratives? Okay, during what art historical period was this work created? What was the function of the work? Where would works such as this have been created? Remember, we're talking about the very early medieval period. The answer to that's going to change in our next unit. The fact that this work was created at all is evidence that what kind of activity was flourishing. The way Christ is portrayed emphasize what aspects of his life and ministry. And we are going to continue to look at the different ways the different cultures depict Christ. What metalworking technique was used to produce the raised gold figures? And finally, what purposes did the jewels on the book serve? Okay, last image. You should recognize these. Again, we just talked about these. During what art historical period was this work made? Who was its patron? The work pairs scenes from what on the left, what on the right? What purpose did the work serve? In other words, what architectural function did it serve? What is it? And what was it made of? Okay, this is a lot. I wish we had more time. You were supposed to have a weekend to be able to study for this test, but between the planned test makeups and the football game, our careful plans went awry. So you're going to need to study for this test, but you should now realize that you're also going to need to know this material for the AP test. Good luck.